Just as the assassin, having been reborn, thrust his poisoned sword at Chu Huajin, I chose to watch coldly from the sidelines. After all, in my previous life, I took a sword blow meant for Chu Huajin and ended up crippled from the waist down. Yet he did it all just so his one true love could become the crown princess. Behind him, he let out a heart-wrenching cry for help. Sanger. I didn't lunge at him as he'd hoped. I just stepped aside. The poisoned sword grazed my sleeve and struck straight at his knees. I smoothed out the skirt, which was still in perfect condition, and smiled softly. Main text. Help. Catch the assassin. The young marquis has been attacked. I cried out in alarm and quickly ducked behind the rockery. The poisoned sword pierced the young marquis's knees, and black blood gushed forth as his agonized screams echoed throughout the Xiangling garden. The guards heard the commotion and immediately drew their swords and rushed to the rescue. Unfortunately, the assassin had already taken his own life by swallowing poison, and the young marquis's kneecap had been corroded by the venom, causing him to faint from the excruciating pain. My older brother heard the commotion and rushed over, scolding me harshly. Sanger, you're clearly an expert in lightness kung fu. Didn't you step in to block the sword? You say you have feelings for the young marquis, yet why did you stand by and watch him die today? I pinched the palm of my hand until 2 tears welled up. Brother, I'm scared. My lightness skills may be good, but that assassin's sword is coated in a deadly poison. If you don't believe me, go ask the secret guard at the home mansion can vouch for me. His older brother avoided his gaze, muttered, It's not your fault what happened today. Go back to the mansion and calm down. Then turned and headed for the young marquis's medical tent. I watched his anxious retreating figure and curled the corners of my mouth in a mocking smile. The assassin had already been dragged away by the guards, and I suddenly noticed a hidden emblem embroidered on the inside of his sash. Seizing the moment when no one was looking, I cut off the piece of fabric and hid it in my sleeve, then boarded the carriage back to the Prime Minister's residence, feigning weakness. As the carriage jolted along, my thoughts gradually drifted back to the past. In my previous life, my beloved young Marquis of Pingjiang, Chu Huajin, invited me to visit the Xiangling garden with him. I was overjoyed and accepted immediately. Every noblewoman in the capital knows how deeply I love Chu Huajin, even though his indifference toward me is plain for all to see. I remained utterly devoted to him so much so that I even turned down a marriage proposal from the current regent. Chu Huajin suggested taking me to see some rare stones. As I watched the maids and guards fall behind, I didn't give it a second thought. My mind was filled only with the joy of being alone with my lover. Just as I was secretly gloating, an assassin in black suddenly darted out from behind the rockery, raising a long sword that glowed with a faint blue, poisonous light, and lunged at him. My head spun, and without a second thought, I charged forward and blocked the blow for him. In the end, Chu Huajin emerged unscathed, while I was left with my meridians corroded by the poison, leaving me crippled from the waist down and confined to a wheelchair for the rest of my life. When I realized I would never be able to stand again, I smashed all the china in the house in a fit of despair and hid in my bed, weeping uncontrollably. To repay my kindness, Chu Huajin offered to marry me. Sanger, you saved my life, and I will treat you well for the rest of my life. You became disabled to save me, and in my heart, you will always be the best girl. I took it at face value, finding renewed hope for living in Chu Huajin's tender gaze, and joyfully prepared for the wedding. Everyone said Chu Huajin was a man of deep loyalty and integrity, and I believed it too. But on the eve of the wedding, as I was passing by the study, I overheard my brother say to Chu Huajin, Your Excellency, you actually set a trap for my sister just to get Ninger to marry the crown prince. What if that poisoned sword had actually taken her life? Chu Huajin sneered. That assassin was a suicide squad member I personally arranged. The poison would only cripple her legs. It wouldn't kill Qin Sang. Ninger has her heart set on the crown prince, but Qin Sang's name is on his list of potential consorts. Now that Qin Sang is crippled, she can forget about ever setting foot in the East Palace, even though Qin Sang looks like a total wreck in her wheelchair right now. Don't worry, I'll make sure she gets a proper place in society. My older brother let out a soft sigh. Your Excellency, We're both deeply in love with Ningner. I understand how you feel. If our parents or grandmother ask any questions, I'll cover for you. I stood frozen outside the study door, as if a bucket of ice water had been poured over my head. I felt as though I had been plunged into an ice cave. The Ning'erthi we're talking about is my cousin, Shin Wanning. It turns out that all the suffering I've endured was the result of a long-planned scheme by my own brother and the man I loved deeply, all to clear the way for her to become the crown princess. What gives them the right to trample on my flesh and blood like this? I'm so angry. I went back to my room in tears to fetch some lamp oil, then lured my cousin into the study, locked the door tight, and set the place ablaze, taking them all down with me. Second young lady. We've arrived at the Prime Minister's residence. The coachman's voice brought me back to reality. I snapped back to my senses, clutched the piece of cloth I'd cut from the assassin's body, and stepped down from the carriage. Clutching my chest, my cousin Shin Wanning was standing at the entrance to the Prime Minister's residence. When she saw me walk down the steps unscathed, she froze in surprise. You actually came back in one piece. I stared intently at Shin Wanning. Does my cousin want me to lose an arm or a leg? Realizing she had spoken out of turn, Shin Wanning quickly forced a sweet smile. What are you saying, sister? With assassins lurking in Xianglin Garden, I was just worried about you. If I hadn't caught a slight chill today, I would have wanted to go with you all. By the way, is the young Marquis all right? I deliberately put on a look of horror. The young Marquis is in such a terrible state. Both his knees have been pierced by a poisoned sword, and the blood flowing from them is black. The imperial physician says he'll be crippled for the rest of his life. It's absolutely horrifying. Shin Wanning's face went pale in an instant. After exchanging a few perfunctory words with me, she walked away, looking completely dazed. In the late afternoon, Shin Wanning's maid, Su Weizhu, brought me a bowl of white fungus and lotus seed soup. Second young lady, seeing that you were startled earlier today, my mistress personally prepared this sweet soup for you to help calm your nerves. I accepted it with a smile, then knocked Cui Shu unconscious with a karate chop, tied her up tight, and shoved her under the bed. I then summoned my personal maid, who was well versed in pharmacology, Banksia. Could you check for Muhat seasonings have been added to this? Banksia leaned in to take a whiff, and her face turned pale. Miss, this soup has been laced with a powerful silencing potion. If you drink it, your voice will be ruined instantly, and you'll never be able to speak again for the rest of your life. The corners of my mouth turned up slightly, and my eyes grew icy. Go get that bottle of Heartbreak Red from the cabinet. Banksia froze. What are you going to do? I cast my eyes down at the bowl of silver ear fungus soup. Since she wants to turn me into a mute, I'll grant her wish. What's the big deal about being unable to speak? Wouldn't taking my life outright make her even happier? Banksia gave me a sympathetic look. Half an hour later, she brought in a bowl of lotus seed pudding freshly prepared in the kitchen. Second young lady, your medicine is ready. I downed the lotus seed soup in one gulp. Go get grandma. A moment later, I suddenly coughed up a mouthful of black blood, and Banksia ran out the door, shrieking, "Help! It's terrible." The second young lady coughed up blood after drinking the soup her cousin sent her. Her screams drew my parents over, and Shin Wanning came running over, looking panicked. Grandmother was soon ushered into my room by Banksia. I was bent over the bed, vomiting blood in great gushes, while a shattered white porcelain stew pot lay on the floor. Her mother turned pale with fright. Quick! Send for the doctor. What are you blind servants standing there for? Hurry up and get a handkerchief to wipe the second young lady's face. Amid the chaos, the family physician from the Prime Minister's residence stumbled over, clutching his medical bag. After taking my pulse, his face turned ashen. Your Excellency, Madam, the second young lady has been poisoned. Judging by her pulse, it appears to be a banned substance from the black market. Heart-rending red. No sooner had the court physician finished speaking than everyone held their breath. Since Shin Wanning's uncle was the underground kingpin who controlled the black market in the capital, this Heartbreak Red was a secret poison he had concocted himself. Once someone was poisoned, their internal organs would burn as if on fire. Without an antidote, They would bleed from all 7 orifices and die within half an hour, while everyone stood there dumbfounded. Banksia took the court physician to the side room to brew the antidote I had prepared earlier. I raised my head weakly and shed tears in a pitiful manner. Cousin, why did you poison me? I know you resent me because the young Marquis became disabled. I beg you. For the sake of our sisterly bond, don't kill me. Only then did Shinwaning realize that I was playing dead. Her innocent victim act, the very thing she prided herself on most, had been preempted by me, and her expression instantly twisted into that of a demon. Shinwaning's mother died young, and her father was a compulsive gambler, out of sisterly affection. My mother took her into our family home and raised her with great care. Mother favored Shinwaning above all others. From childhood onward, if legitimate daughter of the Prime Minister's household could only make clothes from the scraps of fabric she had left over. When Shinwaning smashed the Imperial Jade Rui, Mother punished me by making me kneel in the ancestral hall, claiming I had failed to look after my younger sister. Once, Shinwaning took a fancy to a sandalwood hairpin I had carved myself. When I refused to give it to her, she cried incessantly. My elder brother berated me harshly, and Mother forcibly pulled the hairpin from my hair and shoved it into her hands. Early the next morning, the hairpin was found crushed in 2 pieces and tossed into a muddy puddle in the garden. I was furious. With tears in my eyes, I shoved Shinwaning, knocking her to the ground. Seeing this, my older brother immediately rushed over and shoved me hard to the ground. Ninger said she didn't do it on purpose. The maid dropped it because she didn't hold it steady. It's just a cheap wooden hairpin, how could you be so cruel? I stared at my older brother in disbelief, then glanced at Shinwaning, who was standing behind him, covering her face and giggling. I couldn't help but feel that this so-called blood bond was utterly ridiculous. I didn't poison my sister. Shinwaning wept bitterly as she knelt on the ground. I swallowed the metallic, sweet taste in my throat and immediately interrupted her weakly. Father, Mother, thank goodness this bowl of lotus seed soup was too hot. I only drank half of it. If I'd drunk it all just now, I'd likely be dead by now. If His Majesty were to test us on state policy tomorrow, I'm afraid brother would have to write the answers for me. As soon as those words were spoken, a look of utter panic flashed across my parents' faces. My elder brother was known as the most talented scholar in the capital, but in reality, he was a complete fool. To preserve the reputation of our family, they forced me to immerse myself in the classics and compelled me to ghostwrite his essays and treatises on state affairs. Once, just to catch my parents' attention, I willingly hid in the shadows, handing over every policy essay I'd stayed up all night writing to my brother. He basked in the adulation of scholars and literati, while I toiled away in the study, pouring my heart and soul into his work. My grandmother paused for a moment, having lived most of her life. She quickly grasped the deeper meaning behind my words. She slammed her fist on the table in anger, pointed her finger right at my parents, and let loose with a tirade. You fools! All this time I've been eating vegetarian food and chanting sutras at the family temple. And it turns out I've been praying for the well-being of a bunch of you frauds who deceive the world. I know you favor Xiuan, but how could you possibly do something so despicable as making your own daughter act as a front for your son? My parents trembled with fear as they were scolded. My grandmother, leaning on her cane, walked over to the bed and clasped my hand tightly. Sanger, you've been wronged. My eyes welled up. After I was burned to death in my previous life, everyone said I was a jealous, venomous woman except my grandmother. She secretly sent people to investigate my wrongful death, and only then did she learn that not only had my legs been crippled, but I had also been betrayed by my own family. With tears in her eyes, grandmother went to the Ho family mansion to seek justice, but her brother stopped her. In the ensuing struggle, she fell down the steps and died on the spot. In this lifetime, I will never again be a stepping stone for anyone else's rise to power. I will make everyone who has fed off me spit out every drop they've swallowed. All of you, get out. From now on, I will personally manage the inner quarters of the Prime Minister's residence, grandmother ordered coldly. My father was terrified of my grandmother, so he immediately agreed meekly. My mother's face turned ashen, But she had no choice but to obediently hand over the matching tokens and the ledger. Her parents slunk out, and grandmother looked down on Shinwaning from above. Ever since I returned to the mansion, I've heard the servants gossiping, saying that you live a life more luxurious than the legitimate daughter of the chancellor's household. You get to cut the finest satin first, while my own granddaughter has to wear whatever you leave behind. Shinwaning's eyes immediately welled up with tears, and she put on a look of helpless vulnerability. It's because my aunt takes pity on my lonely and helpless situation that she has shown me a little extra affection. Grandmother snorted coldly and picked up the bowl of poisoned white fungus soup. Do you care that much about that cripple at the Marquis's mansion? Sanger was too afraid to die to shield the young Marquis from the sword. But the young Marquis merely lost the use of his legs. And yet you want Sanger to sacrifice her life to be buried with him. You have the face of a bodhisattva, but your heart is more venomous than a snake or a scorpion. Shinwaning turned pale in an instant. I really didn't poison it. I have no idea why there's heartbreak red in this soup. I drank the antidote that Xiaoxia had brought me, and a bit of color returned to my cheeks. Leaning weakly against the soft pillow, I said, "Cousin, I know you're deeply in love with the young Marquis, but because of your lowly status, you can never be his legitimate wife. So when you heard that the young Marquis had invited me on a trip, you were consumed with jealousy and tried to poison me to death, didn't you?" When had Shinwaning ever been treated so unfairly in her entire life? She was so upset she was nearly beside herself. Throwing all decorum to the wind, she lunged toward the bed, pointed at me, and screamed, "You're talking nonsense. You're the one crying thief when you're the thief. You deliberately poisoned me to frame me." I deliberately didn't flinch. Instead, I tugged at my collar with my free hand and cried out, "Cousin, if you don't want others to know, you mustn't do it yourself. I've already sent Banksia to secretly capture the only informant dealing in banned drugs on the capital's black market. We'll find out when we confront him face to face." Shinwaning was completely panicked. Although she hadn't administered the heart-shattering red, she didn't dare admit that she'd given me a silencing potion instead, so she could only glare at me with venomous hatred. Before long, Banksia walked in with a man who had a sharp nose and sunken cheeks. The man's name was Sun Laolu, a money-grubbing thug. Back when my parents forced me to write on my older brother's behalf, I paid him a hefty sum to run errands for me so I could gather intelligence on the political situation. He was a shrewd man who worked for money. On the way to the Prime Minister's residence, Banksia had already slipped him a gold bar, so as soon as Sun Laolu laid eyes on Shinwaning, he immediately dropped to his knees with a thud. "Cousin, you once paid a fortune to buy a silencing potion from this humble servant, claiming you needed it to silence the vicious dogs in the mansion. How could you possibly use it to harm the second young lady?" Shinwaning was at a loss for words and trembled with rage. "You're making baseless accusations. When did I ever buy medicine from you?" Grandmother was furious. "This is outrageous. With both eyewitnesses and physical evidence against you, how dare you still try to wriggle out of this?" Shinwaning, do you really want me to drag you before the prefect of the capital and let the whole city see the true colors of the Prime Minister's niece? Shinwaning collapsed to the ground in terror. She dared not face the authorities. If word got out that she had bought a poison to harm her elder sister, her reputation would be completely ruined. Forget becoming the crown princess, she wouldn't even be fit to be a concubine in an ordinary official's household. Perhaps realizing that her protests were futile, Shinwaning gritted her teeth and knelt on the ground. "It was a moment of foolishness on my part that startled my elder sister. I begged grandmother to punish me." Grandmother's gaze turned icy. "My dear niece has a wicked heart. She has harmed her own siblings. Guards, bring forth the family discipline." Shinwaning was pinned down on a bench in the courtyard and received a full 50 lashes. The beating left her flesh torn and bleeding, and her piercing screams echoed throughout the rear courtyard of the Prime Minister's residence. I looked coldly at her pitiful state. Ever since she arrived at the Prime Minister's residence, I have suffered greatly over the past 10 years, just because I ate one extra piece of bird's nest pastry. She cried and accused me of calling her an outsider, causing mother to punish me by making me copy the admonitions for women for 3 days and 3 nights. Just because I refused to embroider the screen she intended to show off at the flower viewing banquet. She claimed, with a look of hurt, that I looked down on her. causing my brother to burn all my manuscripts in a single blaze. In my past life, I always believed that yielding would win me my family's love, but they trampled on my concessions and even allowed my brother to drain me dry to pave the way for Shinwaning. How could I not hate them? After the 50 lashes were administered, grandmother said calmly, "Take her back. Don't let her die." As night fell, I snuggled close to my grandmother and pulled the piece of fabric I had cut from the assassin's belt out of my sleeve. "Grandmother, I suspect the assassin who tried to kill the young Marquis at Shangling Garden wasn't a suicide bomber. I cut this piece of fabric from the assassin's belt. Judging by this emblem, he seems to be a secret guard in someone's private service." Grandmother took the fabric and examined it closely. Then her expression suddenly darkened. "This black tortoise embroidery is a mark unique to the secret guards of the Marquis of Pingjiang's mansion." I looked sad and said, "Everyone knows I'm in love with the young Marquis, even though he treats me with indifference. I still can't live without him. If he were in danger, I would risk my life to save him, but the one thing I fear is that poisoned blade. Could it be that this assassination attempt was orchestrated by the young Marquis himself?" I deliberately left the sentence unfinished. But my grandmother understood immediately. She stroked my hair and sighed, saying, "Now that you've seen through his true intentions, you should cut your losses while you still can." With tears in my eyes, I nodded solemnly. After that day, I no longer turned away the gifts sent by the regent. The regent's personal guards bring rare treasures to the chancellor's residence every day. Yesterday it was Snow Mountain ice silk, a commodity worth its weight in gold. Today it's a night pearl from the East Sea the size of a fist. And tomorrow it will be an authentic painting by a master from the previous dynasty. I accepted them all, and then personally prepared a medicinal dish to soothe the stomach, which I had the guards deliver to the regent. I heard that the regent enjoyed it immensely. Even though the medicinal broth was bitter and hard to swallow, he drank it all without batting an eye. On the very day I accepted the purple jade phoenix hairpin sent by the regent as a token of our betrothal. The young Marquis's elder brother returned to the Pingjiang Marquis's mansion after having looked after him for a fortnight. As soon as he returned to the mansion, he headed straight for Shinwaning's quarters. According to the informant I had planted there, Shinwaning was sobbing so hard she could barely catch her breath, and she had embellished her account of the beating she'd suffered. My dear brother was so enraged that he smashed a cup, cursed me as a venomous woman, and vowed to seek justice for her. I rewarded the informant with a bag of silver coins, then calmly took a sip of Junshan silver needle tea. The young Marquis's leg must be completely ruined by now. Anxia nodded. The Marquis's household has consulted every renowned physician, and they all say there's no hope. The young Marquis has undergone a drastic change in temperament. He spends his days holed up in his room, smashing things, and cannot bear to see any living creature that runs or jumps. A few days ago, the young Marquis saw a stray cat darting through the courtyard and, in a frenzy, ordered the servants to beat it to death with sticks. The Marquis, heartbroken over his son, actually gave orders to saw off every single threshold in the entire Marquis' estate. I raised an eyebrow. The house of the Marquis of Pingjiang is a hereditary noble house. The threshold represents the ancestral legacy. Now that the threshold has been sawed off, I fear the house of the Marquis of Pingjiang's fortune is coming to an end. Suddenly, a commotion of footsteps sounded outside the door. My older brother kicked the door open in a rage, pointed a finger at my nose, and shouted, "Qin Sang, you have such a wicked heart, how dare you slander Ninger by accusing her of poisoning you? And you even colluded with grandmother to beat her so badly she couldn't get out of bed for half a month. Today, I'm going to tear off your mask of hypocrisy for Ninger's sake." I let out a cold laugh and flung the scalding tea at his feet. "Since you think I've wronged her, brother, then take that bottle of silencing potion right now and go beat the drum at the prefect's office to cry out for justice. Go ask Shinwaning does she dare to confront me face-to-face in the courtroom." Seeing that I showed no fear and even threatened to report him to the authorities, my brother's arrogance was instantly cut in half. Though he favored Shinwaning above all others, he was still mindful of his reputation as the eldest son of the minister's household. Fuming with rage, he pointed at me and shouted, "Yuri, completely unreasonable." I jumped to my feet and took a step toward him. "You're the one who's unreasonable, Qin Shiyan. Let me give you some advice. Stop acting like my big brother in front of me. If you push me too far, I'll rip off your capital's top scholar facade in a heartbeat. My brother stared at me in disbelief, as if he had seen a ghost. His face turned pale and ashen, and finally, he flung his sleeves and fled my courtyard in disarray. I watched my older brother's back as he walked away, looking as though he had lost his parents. My gaze icy. In my past life, I poured my heart and soul into writing one magnificent essay after another, all to earn a shred of praise from my parents. I kept a low profile in the household and made every effort to accommodate Shinwaning. Yet my patience and forbearance were rewarded with their conspiracy to throw me into the fire. Now that I've been given a second chance at life, I can't stand this rotten family bond, it's disgusting. Less than half a month had passed since things had settled down, and Shinwaningho had only just been able to get out of bed and walk around, can't wait to start causing trouble again. At lunchtime, she warmly served a bowl of chicken soup and placed it before me. Sister, even though you now have the regent's backing, you've known the young Marquis for some time. Now that he's crippled, you really ought to pay him a visit. You've always been a person of honor and loyalty. Surely you wouldn't do something so crass as to flatter the powerful and shun the poor. With just a few words, she had me on the hot seat, trying to brand me as heartless and ungrateful, and deliberately goading me into meeting that crazy little Marquis. If I don't go, rumors that I've abandoned my former lover will surely spread throughout the capital by tomorrow. I gave her a faint, flawless smile. You're right, cousin. Why don't you come with me tomorrow to the Marquis's residence to visit the young Marquis? What do you say? A calculating gleam flashed in Shinwaning's eyes as she nodded repeatedly. Sure, I'll go with you tomorrow. The following afternoon, Shinwaning and I boarded a carriage bound for the Marquis of Pingjiang's mansion. She stroked the milk-white jade bracelet on her wrist. Sister, this bracelet was originally meant to be part of your dowry from Auntie, but she said my skin is as fair as snow and that it would complement my complexion better on me. So she gave it to me. I knew she was deliberately provoking me, wanting to see me go crazy with jealousy and break down in tears, looking like a complete fool so she could spread rumors about my emotional outburst and make the regent think I was a shrew unfit for public life. I glanced at it indifferently. Second-hand stuff that someone else has worn, only my cousin would treasure it. Shinwaning's face froze as she was taken aback. She apparently hadn't expected that not only did I not cry, but I actually shot back at her. Unfortunately, I've completely given up on my parents, so her petty provocations aren't even worth a second glance. The atmosphere at the Marquis of Pingjiang's mansion was gloomy, and the servants were on edge. The Marquise, her face gaunt, exchanged a few polite words with us before having a maid lead us to the young Marquis's courtyard. Shinwaning's eyes darted about. Then she suddenly clutched her stomach and frowned. Ouch! I ate too many cold fruits yesterday, and now my stomach hurts. Where is the nearest restroom? The maid pointed her in the right direction, then continued to lead me further inside. Anxia quietly fell back 2 steps and followed Shinwaning from a distance. The maid soon pushed open a tightly closed door, and a strong, bitter medicinal scent wafted out. Young Marquis, the second young lady of the Prime Minister's household has come to see you. Chu Huajin sat in a wooden wheelchair, his hair disheveled, his once handsome features now slightly contorted with venomous hatred. He glared at me with such intensity, looking just like a venomous snake lurking in a gutter. I feigned surprise and took a half step back. Young Marquis, has your leg injury improved at all? Chu Huajin suddenly spun his wheelchair forward, his voice hoarse and terrifying. Qin sang, you know martial arts. You should have blocked that sword for me. You're the one who should be sitting in a wheelchair. A cripple. Why didn't you save me this time? My pupils suddenly contracted. He's been reborn too. Chu Huajin gripped the armrests of her wheelchair tightly, her eyes bloodshot as she glared at me. Didn't you swear a solemn oath before the Buddha that you would marry no one but me in this lifetime? Didn't you say that no matter what I became, you would love me with your very life? When I was attacked by an assassin, why didn't you die in my place? I let out a scornful, cold laugh. Young Marquis, have you lost your mind? The person you're describing was the foolish fool I was in my past life. In this life, I find you repulsive, Perhaps because his pride had been utterly shattered. Chu Huajin was shaking with rage. Since his legs had lost all sensation, he couldn't even stand up to slap me. Instead, he could only pound his withered legs in a fit of helpless fury. I slowly and deliberately smoothed my cloud-like hair, casually revealing the purple jade phoenix hairpin at my temple gift from the regent himself. Sure enough, Chu Huajin's eyes were pierced by the jade hairpin that symbolized his status, and he roared hysterically. Qin sang, "You fickle woman who clings to the powerful." The Marquise heard the commotion and hurried over to calm the frenzied Chu Huajin. She shot me a disapproving glance. "Miss Qin, I know you've caught the regent's eye these days, but since you're here to visit the sick, you shouldn't be flaunting the regent's gift in front of Jinyu." I looked at her with an innocent expression. His Royal Highness the Regent has repeatedly urged me never to take this purple jade phoenix hairpin off. If I were to remove it, it would be an act of disrespect. "I'd beg your forgiveness, madam." The Marquise's face turned ashen. But she wouldn't dare speak ill of the regent even if she had 100 times the courage. She could only grit her teeth and force a smile. I spoke out of turn. "Miss Qin, please come into the warm chamber and have a cup of hot tea before you leave." I went along with her to the warm chamber, where Shenwaning had indeed just returned from the lavatory and was smiling as she came to greet us. Pointing to the 2 teacups on the table, she said, "Sister, the Dragon's Nest snow tea from the Marquise estate is simply exquisite. I just poured you a cup myself, do give it a try." I picked up the teacup in front of me and suddenly looked behind her in alarm. "Brother, what are you doing here?" Shenwaning suddenly turned to look back, taking advantage of the cover provided by my wide sleeves. I swiftly switched the 2 teacups. She turned back and said with a playful pout, "Sister, you're teasing me again. How could Brother Xuan possibly come to the rear courtyard of the Marquise mansion?" I smiled apologetically. "It was just a case of mistaken identity. Please don't hold it against me, cousin." Shenwaning eagerly picked up the cup of tea in front of her. "Sister, drink it while it's still hot." I downed the tea in one gulp. "This tea really is delicious." She stared at my empty teacup, a malicious glint of triumph flashing in her eyes. "It's stifling in the warm chamber. Sister, shall I accompany you to the back garden for some fresh air?" I nodded, and Shenwaning immediately grabbed my arm and pulled me out. Anxia tried to follow, but one of Shenwaning's maids found an excuse to stop her. After all her winding and turning, she actually led me back to Chu Huajin's courtyard. I stopped in front of the half-open door and looked at her flushed cheeks with a half-smile. "Cousin, are you feeling hot?" Shenwaning's eyes were glazed over. Clearly, the potent aphrodisiac had taken effect. Overcome by a burning desire, she tore open her collar, completely losing all sense of reason, then turned and staggered toward Chu Huajin inside the room. "Young Marquis, Ningner has admired you for a long time." Just as Chu Huajin was seething with resentment, a soft, fragrant body suddenly threw itself into his arms. He was about to push her away when he caught the familiar sweet scent on Shenwaning. Confined to a wheelchair and clinging to life, he was desperate for someone to take his frustration out on. His eyes immediately turned red, and he yanked Shenwaning to the ground, tearing at her clothes on the cold 4-poster bed. Not wanting to watch this painful sight any longer, I quietly stepped back and slipped into the corner of the corridor. About half an hour later, Shenwaning's maid finally came running in, feigning panic, and shouted, "Oh no! How did the second young lady end up in the young Marquis's room?" The Marquise, having been alerted, arrived in a grand procession accompanied by a large entourage of maids and matrons, intent on catching the adulterers in the act. I strolled leisurely at the back of the crowd, watching as the Marquise kicked the door open, revealing a man and a woman on the 4-poster bed, barely clothed and tightly entwined. Qin sang, "You shameless little slut. You've clearly already been with the Regent Prince." I raised my voice. "Madam Ho, I'm right here. That disheveled young woman on the couch looks very familiar to me." The Marquise's voice trailed off abruptly, and her eyes widened in disbelief. There's certainly been no shortage of drama at the Marquis of Pingjiang's residence today. I merely happened to be passing by and decided to take a look. only to stumble upon such a romantic tale of love and passion. The regent's deep, authoritative voice rang out from outside the courtyard. He wore a dark black robe embroidered with dark gold pythons. His stature was imposing, and his peerlessly handsome face exuded a cold, commanding aura. Having held the reins of government for many years, the regent could see right through the sordid and underhanded schemes of the inner court. He shot a look of utter disgust at Chu Huajin and Shen Wanning, who were still entangled on the bed, then strode forward and wrapped me tightly in his large cloak. Sanger, don't look, it'll soil your eyes. I leaned obediently into his embrace, then adopted a look of pity. Your Highness, since my cousin and the young Marquis have already become intimate, why not do us a favor and grant us your blessing for marriage? The regent let out a cold laugh and immediately made his decision. Such a distinction as an imperial arranged marriage was enough to completely ruin the Marquis family's reputation. Shen Wanning was jolted awake by a bucket of cold water. As the effects of the drug wore off, she found herself surrounded by faces filled with contempt and mockery. She looked down in bewilderment and suddenly realized she was barely clothed. She had actually committed an act of indecency with a crippled young Marquis in broad daylight. Her vision went black. Overcome with shame and indignation, she fainted on the spot. But Chu Huajin's eyes were filled with a sickening madness as he clamped his hands tightly around Shen Wanning's waist. Ninger, you are still my woman after all. I sneered inwardly. Shen Wanning had only herself to blame. Since she wanted to use drugs to ruin my reputation, I would let her taste the bitterness of having her life and reputation destroyed. Chu Huajin got his wish and married his moonlight. And now that the two of them are completely bound together, they really are a perfect match. After the regent escorted me back to the Prime Minister's residence, the atmosphere there had completely changed. I am now the undisputed princess consort regent. And my parents no longer look at me with disgust, but with extreme flattery and ingratiation. When they learned that Shen Wanning had actually engaged in public debauchery in broad daylight at the Marquis' mansion and become pregnant out of wedlock even if she wasn't actually pregnant yet. Her reputation was as good as ruined. They began to treat me like a goddess. My mother, who normally wouldn't lift a finger to do housework, personally simmered a nourishing broth and brought it to me. And my father, who had always been kind only to my older brother, praised my handwriting for the first time in his life. I accepted their flattery with indifference. It didn't stir a single ripple in my heart. Their so-called familial bonds are nothing more than a calculation of who can bring greater power and influence to the Prime Minister's household. Shen Wanning, with her tainted reputation, is destined to marry nothing more than a crippled marquis, while I am about to become the regent's consort second only to the emperor himself. Naturally, they know exactly which side to take. Qin sang, what on earth happened at the Marquis' mansion today? Why has Ninger become Chu Huajin's fiancé? If you don't explain yourself, I'll beat you to death today, you wicked woman. My brother kicked open the gate to my courtyard like a raging beast. Father slammed his fist down on the table. How dare you? How do you speak to your sister like that? My older brother was already beside himself with jealousy. He rushed up to me, his eyes bloodshot, and raised his hand. You'd better explain this to me. Without a moment's hesitation, I slapped him across the face with the back of my hand, sending him stumbling back 2 steps. Looking down at him with a cold glare, I said, Qin Shiyan, do you realize that Shen Wanning slipped an aphrodisiac into my tea today? If I hadn't noticed it in time and switched my teacup, I would have been the one to suffer ruin and disgrace today, and the reputation of your Prime Minister's household would have been dragged through the mud. When the regent gets his hands on you, not only will he strip you of your title as the foremost scholar, but your father won't even be able to keep his official post. As the eldest son of the Prime Minister's household, all you do is fawn over your cousin, without me writing your essays for you. You haven't been able to produce a single decent essay in over half a year. You're nothing but a good for nothing. Everything that happened today is entirely Shen Wanning's own fault. Have I made myself clear? Brother, do you still want to beat me to death? His older brother clutched his swollen cheek, his lips trembling, his face as pale as a sheet. It can't be. Ninger is so pure and kind, how could she possibly have drugged him? That crippled Chu Huajin must have forced her. He's a good for nothing, how could he ever be worthy of Ninger? I let out a scornful snort. In my brother's heart, even if he could not marry Jhan Wanning himself, he still hoped she would marry into the Eastern Palace and live a life of privilege. He knew full well that he was no match for the crown prince in either power or status. So he was able to swallow his pride. But what was Chu Huajin, anyway? A cripple who could never walk again. Besides, Chu Huajin had always been on such friendly terms with his older brother that the latter had subconsciously always felt superior to him. Now that Jhan Wanning had actually married a cripple he looked down on, how could he possibly swallow his pride? People feel nothing but awe toward those who are far beyond their reach. But when someone who was once their equal or even their inferior takes away what is most precious to them, they are filled with nothing but overwhelming hatred. His older brother suddenly let out a bestial roar, turned, and stormed out of the Prime Minister's residence. I'm going to kill him. Early the next morning, the capital was in an uproar. The eldest son of the minister's family, sword in hand, charged single-handedly into the Marquis of Pingjiang's mansion, determined to fight Chu Huajin to the death. He declared that since Chu Huajin was a cripple, he was unworthy of Jhan Wanning, and that if he won, he would take Jhan Wanning away with him. To everyone's surprise, Chu Huajin actually agreed to this absurd scheme to steal his wife away. I was pruning a pot of black orchids when I heard the news. Are the guards at the home mansion just for show? How could they let him run wild in the mansion? Banksia reported in a low voice. It is said that the young Marquis deliberately provoked the eldest young master. The young Marquis led the eldest young master to the highest observatory tower in the Marquis' estate, claiming they would settle the matter unknown up there. The pruning shears in my hand paused briefly. And a faint, icy smile played at the corners of my mouth. 3 days later, on the day of the final showdown, I, an onlooker familiar to both families, was invited by the lady of the home mansion to the foot of the stargazing pavilion. It was a windy, overcast day, wrapped in a long cloak. I watched coldly as my elder brother, sword in hand, advanced step by step toward Chu Huajin, who sat in a wheelchair. From the top of the tall pavilion, Jhan Wanning stood nearby, her tears streaming down her face. Brother Xuan, don't act on impulse. Don't let our relationship suffer because of me. I raised an eyebrow and stared intently at a hidden mortise on the attic railing. Although Chu Huajin's legs were crippled, his sharp tongue remained undiminished. As he dodged his brother's attacks, he taunted him with the most vicious language, every word painting a vivid picture of the details of that day on the four-poster bed. His brother's eyes were bloodshot, his reason completely gone, and every strike of his sword was deadly. Chu Huajin's wheelchair was forced up against the wooden railing at the edge of the attic. He had assumed the railing was incredibly sturdy and was just about to use a hidden weapon to fight back. My older brother let out a roar, threw down his sword, and lunged forward, clamping his hands tightly around Chu Huajin's neck and shoving him hard. There was a sharp crack. The wooden railing, which should have been as sturdy as iron, snapped like rotten wood. Chu Huajin, along with his wheelchair, traced a desperate arc through the air before crashing heavily onto the blue stone slabs below the attic. His brain matter spurted out, blood pooled on the floor, and he died instantly. His older brother on the attic remained frozen in the wind. Still in the act of pushing him, the Marchioness let out a piercing scream and fainted on the spot. My brother collapsed to the ground, trembling uncontrollably, completely dumbfounded. The railing. How could it have broken? Did I kill someone? Jhan Wanning looked down at the young Marquis lying dead at her feet, then glanced at the eldest son of the Prime Minister's family, who was slumped on the ground. Suddenly, she broke down, covering her face and letting out a desperate scream. I gave Banksia a approving look over my shoulder. The girl was becoming more and more meticulous in her work. A few days ago, I casually mentioned, the stargazing pavilion has been neglected for so long. And with all the wind and rain it's been exposed to, I'm afraid the railings aren't very sturdy anymore. Before I knew it, she had gone and corroded the mortise and tenon joints on those sections of the railing. The next day, the mansion of the Marquis of Pingjiang was adorned with a sea of white sails. In the golden hall, the Marquis of Pingjiang wept bitterly as he knelt and banged his head on the floor more than a dozen times. Your Majesty, This old servant has but this one and only son, and now he has been brutally murdered at the hands of that scoundrel in the Chancellor's mansion. I beg your majesty to have Qin Shi Huan torn to pieces. Otherwise, this old servant will smash his head against this quill dragon pillar and follow my son in death. The emperor had long been wary of the factionalism and self-serving schemes within the Chancellor's household in recent years. Now that such a shocking murder had occurred, he immediately issued an edict ordering his elder brother to be thrown into a death cell and executed after the autumn harvest. My father was willing to spend every last penny of our fortune to save my older brother. He knelt outside the imperial study for a day and a night. Yet he still could not change the emperor's mind. That evening, dressed in mourning white, I struck the drum of petitions outside the palace gates. Late at night in the grand hall, under the emperor's scrutinizing gaze, I bowed my head deeply. Your Majesty, I am guilty. In a desperate attempt to win my parents' slightest mercy, I willingly assumed a false identity to write my brother's examination essays and draft his governance strategies. Qin Shi Huan is by no means the capital's foremost scholar. All his reputation for talent is nothing but the fruit of my labor. Now that the Prime Minister's household has committed the grave crime of deceiving the sovereign, I do not wish to compound my error. I have come here to offer my life as a testament to my resolve. As soon as these words were spoken, the entire hall erupted in an uproar. The emperor ordered his attendants to bring forth my elder brother's old writings and compare them with the exam paper I had just completed. The handwriting and writing style were identical, making the difference in quality immediately apparent. The emperor remained silent for a long time, then suddenly burst out laughing. The Chancellor's family has truly produced a fine daughter. Chancellor Qin is blind to her worth, has mistaken a pearl for a fish's eye. The case involving the Crown Prince of Pingjiang will be handled impartially. As for you, with your extraordinary talent, I shall make an exception and grant you access to the imperial study, bestowing upon you the rank of 5th grade female official. My heart was filled with peace, and I bowed deeply. Thank you, Lord, for your great mercy. The regent stepped forward at just the right moment, standing tall and graceful. Your Majesty, this servant and Lady Qin are deeply in love. I humbly request that your Majesty grant us permission to marry. The emperor readily agreed. 3 months later, when spring has arrived and the flowers are in bloom, it is the perfect time for weddings. Dressed in a bright red wedding gown, I was carried in an 8-man palanquin directly from the residence granted to me to the regent's mansion. The regent and I were deeply in love and governed the realm together. Within a year, I became pregnant, a fact that aroused the envy of every noblewoman in the capital, and my arrogant elder brother was beheaded and displayed in public on a drizzly autumn afternoon. My parents, accused of deceiving the emperor and failing to raise their son properly, were stripped of their official posts, had their property confiscated, and were banished back to our impoverished hometown, where they spent the rest of their lives in poverty. As for Shen Wanning, that harbinger of misfortune who brought ruin to her husband, the distraught Marquis of Pingjiang and his wife forced her to swallow a potion that rendered her mute, placed her in a flimsy coffin, arranged a posthumous marriage for her with Chu Huajin, and buried her alive in a dark underground chamber. That's the end of the story. Thank you all for reading. See you in the next one.